Okay, well, we've been talking about McCarthyism, the Red Scare, all of this fear of communism. We talked about capturing spies in the United States, China falling to the communists, and a lot of things that made the United States very fearful of this inevitable war, supposedly, that Joseph Stalin had promised. And so building up our nuclear arsenal was part of that. And so we kept up our research. We tested thousands of nuclear bombs throughout the 1950s. And in 1952, we actually created a hydrogen bomb, a bomb that was 67 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it added to those three Cold War assumptions that communism was evil, bent on world domination, and all controlled by the Soviet Union, when less than a year later, the Soviet Union developed their own atomic bomb, hydrogen bomb. And so this arms race over nuclear weapons proceeded all through the 1950s and 60s. And so just kind of showing you some numerical stuff here. The United States in 1945 obviously had two atomic bombs. We used one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, and no one else had any. By 1955, we had built 2,280 nuclear weapons, and the Soviets had 200. We helped the British come up with their atomic bomb to have a safe ally in Europe with 10. A decade later, we had 31,642 nuclear bombs to 6,129 for the Soviet Union. France, China also gained one by then, and so you have 5 nuclear nations. Now, problem for us was we didn't know the Soviet Union's totals like we do today. And so there was constant fear that they were catching us, that they had similar numbers. They actually wanted us to think they were stronger, so they helped feed that with false information to the point where we kept building up and building up and building up our nuclear arsenal throughout the 1950s, costing us a lot of money, billions of dollars. And we reached a point by the middle 1950s where if there was this inevitable nuclear war between us and the Soviet Union, it was going to be mad. Not just crazy mad, but mutual assured destruction. That there would really not be any winners. I mean, if you take even the top 200 U.S. cities in 1955 and took them off the map in the United States, that takes out 65 to 70% of our U.S. population, most all of our industry, manufacturing, everything. So even the winner of a nuclear exchange is going to lose. Okay, they're going to be destroyed. But that fear led to the building of nuclear fallout shelters. Throughout the country, you may have recognized this nuclear fallout symbol up here. You might see it still today, even on buildings, especially older buildings.
Normal patterns of politics and culture.
The Soviet Union almost immediately decided that it was going to launch its own effort to develop an atomic weapon. By 1949, just 4 years after the end of the war, the Russians tested their first atomic weapon, and with that, a full-fledged arms race was indeed underway.
The fears that people had from World War II transferred onto the Cold War, which works its way into culture in terms of the sort of dark films that are made. You know, if there are no possibilities in life, fear isn't so important. But if you really think that life is going to get better, then the notion that it might all end is pretty awful.
Fear of a nuclear holocaust gives birth to a progression of civil defense strategy.
The blast shelters that were being suggested and talked about were enormously expensive. There was the so-called duck and cover campaign, and propaganda was used to try to persuade people that they could protect themselves that way.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
And you can see there, schools start doing duck and cover drills, just like you do fire drills or tornado drills today. Now, obviously, if we were at the epicenter of an attack, duck and cover is not going to do any good. But if you're far enough away that just the energy from the blast knocks through windows and caves in buildings and things, getting underneath something might save your life anyway. Especially when they started this program, they didn't quite understand the nuclear radiation fallout aspect of things. But even with that, just finding a way to get underground, trying to get into bunkers, trying to cover up and get underneath the desk or something might save your life, especially initially. So we talked about 1952. Eisenhower was elected when we talked about the Cold War stuff, but we didn't talk a lot about how and why. Truman could have ran for a third term. He was grandfathered in. They had actually amended the Constitution after FDR, so that after he had died, they changed the Constitution to where you could not have more than 2 terms. But since Truman was already in office when they did that, he could have ran for a third. He chooses not to. And so the Republicans nominate Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Democrats then nominate Democratic Senator from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower wins in a landslide. He's the perfect candidate for 1952 America. The height of the Cold War and the fear of Soviet aggression, he is a general and a very, very accomplished general who was the head of NATO. He was also the Supreme Allied Commander and hero of World War II. You have more veterans voting than at any time ever in the history of the United States. And so he wins, and he wins going away. He is the oldest president at that time ever elected. He'll actually have a couple of heart attacks while president. And so to kind of balance that out, he finds a very popular congressman at the time period who was much younger in the form of Representative Richard Nixon, who got famous for trying to prosecute Alger Hiss successfully, and was a popular congressman at the time and quite a bit younger than Eisenhower to kind of balance things out for him. Now, Eisenhower does the one thing as president that only Dwight D. Eisenhower could have done in 1952. He reduced the size of our military budget. If Truman would have tried to reduce our spending on the military in 1952, they would have probably impeached him. What the heck's he doing? He's going to make us, vulnerable to communist aggression. He's a communist appeaser. But when Dwight D. Eisenhower does it, the General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, NATO Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, reduces our military spending by $15 billion. It's hard to argue. Nobody has his resume. If he says that we can still be safe by doing that, then he's probably right. So he's able to do it when probably nobody else could have pulled that off politically. Now, how he does it is he shrinks the size of our actual conventional military. Less bases, less troops who need clothing and food and training and pension plans and health care and salaries, and spends more on nuclear weapons. And he says to everybody in the world that if you mess with us, we will nuke you. Now, if Truman said that, a guy like Stalin probably would have called his bluff. But when General Eisenhower, hero of World War II, stood up to Hitler, won the war, made the decisions on D-Day, says, we'll do it, Stalin's going to believe it. And so he's able to use the threat of a nuclear weapon to actually save us a lot of money while president, and saves us about $15 billion a year. Now, another thing that he does to save us money is he sat there in Europe during World War II, and he watched them torpedo dead guys out of ships and use fictional armies, and he used double agents. And so he figures if we can use this new Central Intelligence Agency that was formed after World War II to achieve our foreign policy without having to fight wars, that's a financial savings. And he uses it a couple of times very famously, possibly incorrectly, right after World War II. And it kind of illustrates that balance that we talk about between communism and anything that's not communism. In 1951, Iran, which at that point had actually been a rather progressive nation, they'd separated themselves from the Quran as far as their law and legal system. They had given women a lot of rights that a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries hadn't done. Their people were rather poor still, though. And countries like Great Britain had been coming in and buying up their oil rights in order to make money. And so the Iranian government decided to nationalize or take over all the oil fields so that they would now be owned by the country of Iran and not outside countries' businesses. Now, when a government buys up all of an industry, it sounds very much like communism. And so all our communist bells and whistles ring. And so we decide that we're going to need to stop that. We can't let all the oil fall into the hands of a communist country. And so he uses the CIA to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh and replace him with a pro-American Shah. The Shah is a religious leader. It's going to lead to religious fanaticism in the region. It's going to lead to backlash. In the late 1970s, Iranian nationals are going to take over hostages from the United States. for over a year, so it kind of backfires in the long run. We do the same thing in Guatemala as well. In Guatemala, they have 200,000 acres of American-owned land, agricultural land that the Guatemalan government seizes and tries to turn over to their peasants. And once again, government ownership of land, collectivized farming, sounds like communism. So we send the CIA in again and overthrow the Guatemalan government. In 1953, Joseph Stalin dies and is replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is a veteran of World War II. He's a tough guy, but at least he's not a homicidal maniac like Joseph Stalin was, so we start to feel like maybe we can actually work with him a little bit. So, 1955, we've now rebuilt West Germany. We allow them to begin governing themselves and operating as a separate democratic West Germany. This makes the Soviet Union scared, and so they create their own version of NATO, an alliance between all the communist countries in Europe known as the Warsaw Pact. And so by 1955, you have all the communist countries on one side in the Warsaw Pact, all the democratic countries on the other side in the form of NATO. Another thing I want you to look at here just is the kind of defense spending that took place during this era. These four different pie charts. The top left one is 1940, the last full year before World War II started, the last full year of peacetime in the U.S., and we spent about 18% of our total tax revenue by the federal government on defense. 2000 in the bottom right corner is the last year before 9/11, and we spent about 16% of our federal budget on defense. The two others, 1950 is the last full year before the Korean War, and the Cold War has started, but it's still getting going, and we spent 32%. So World War II is over. We're still a year away from the Korean War, and we're spending 32% still on the military 5 years after World War II was over. Then in 1960, it didn't go down, it kept going up. 1960 is 7 years after the Korean War, but yet still 5 full years before the Vietnam War, and we're spending over half of all of our tax revenue on defense. So the top right and bottom left just kind of illustrate how much the Cold War kept the military going and spending, even though we didn't actually fight that many. We weren't actually fighting wars at those two different times. The United States spent $609 billion building nuclear bombs during the Cold War. We'll spend $46 billion dismantling them and reducing the size of our arsenal. That way we don't have to protect them and they don't get risk of getting stolen or something going wrong. And another $543 billion cleaning up the radioactive waste that's left over. So a lot of money spent in the Cold War in fear of Soviet attack that could have probably went elsewhere had we been able to settle it. Cold War not just about the military, it's also about prestige, and the race to space is a large part of that. And the Soviet Union kind of jumped out to an early lead in rockets and space technology, and we were playing catch up. So we kind of had the nuclear thing down, but we definitely didn't have the space race part of it down. And our first few attempts were rather embarrassing, actually. But October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first ever satellite into space. First time they were able to shoot a rocket out of the Earth's atmosphere and put something up into orbit that stayed there. And you can see in the top right corner just what that first satellite looked like. And it orbited the Earth at about 18,000 miles an hour, circled the globe every 96 minutes. All it really did was send back a beeping signal so that you knew it was up there. But the potential is what scared everybody. That thing now maybe could be taking pictures, possibly weaponize it, and how do you stop it when it's over top of our country every hour and a half? And it embarrassed us. The Soviets beat us. Apparently they were smarter than us. There was talk in the United States about going to a 6-day school week, talks about possibly going till 5 o'clock, doing an 8 to 5 school schedule, definitely increasing our math and science requirements so that we could catch up with the Soviet Union. We ended up creating NASA and pouring billions of dollars into the space program to try to get ourselves caught back up with the Soviet Union as a result. Our first attempts were very embarrassing. You'll see at the end of this video here, our first attempts kind of look like a failed sixth grade science project.
In 1950, American scientists were perfecting color television, tranquilizers, and Xerox copying machines. Amateur inventors all over the world were creating gadgets galore to make our lives easier and more fun. There was the radio-controlled golf caddy. And the robot lawnmower to make our suburban life even more mobile. One ingenious angler built a flying boat as a way around or over traffic jams on rivers and lakes. And a company in Ohio considered marketing an inflatable plane that could fold up and fit in the trunk of a car. There were many advances in flying in the early 50s, like the world's largest jet helicopter, built by Howard Hughes, and radical new turboprop fighters that could take off and land vertically. By mid-decade, Boeing was testing our first jetliner, the 707. And our new intercontinental B-52s were in fail-safe positions all over the world. In 1957, Major John Glenn flew a Navy Crusader coast to coast in 3 hours and 23 minutes, reaching speeds of better than 1,000 miles an hour. In 1959, the Navy X-15 rocket plane flew at 3,000 miles an hour and altitudes of 300,000 feet. The X-15 was designed to carry our first astronauts into space, and at the end of the decade, test pilots were practicing moon landings on the desert. The most dramatic medical advance of the 50s was the Salk vaccine that immunized us against polio. When a bill was presented for Congress to provide free Salk vaccine to all children, Mrs. Ovita Culp Hobby, Ike's Secretary of Health, was horrified. She called the plan socialized medicine through the back door. Other medical news was not so good. In 1953, smoking was first linked to cancer and heart disease. Cigarette consumption dipped for 2 years, but resumed its rise in '55 after the tobacco industry pumped millions into TV advertising for new filter tips.
Promenade straight down the pike. It's time right now for a lucky strike. Yes, for smoking that you're bound to like, you just can't beat a lucky strike.
The first hydrogen bomb explosion in 1952 opened a new era of deathmanship. Since 1945, when the first A-bomb was exploded, American scientists had argued the morality of developing super bombs, perhaps 1,000 times more destructive than those dropped on Japan. The decision to create an arsenal of new nuclear weapons was made right after Russia exploded her own atom bomb in 1949. High on the Pentagon shopping list was the atomic cannon, an awesome piece of hardware that was semi-retired when ground-to-ground missiles became operational at the end of the decade. And in 1954, Mrs. Eisenhower christened the Nautilus, the world's first atomic submarine. The Nautilus could circle the globe underwater. And in 1958, the ship sailed submerged from Hawaii to Great Britain, under the North Pole. Not all atomic research of the 50s was military. Since Hiroshima, scientists were experimenting with nuclear energy as an alternative to oil, gas, and coal. In 1957, an atomic power plant, the pilot model for 3 Mile Island, was proudly unveiled to the public. Other visionaries were not so certain that the public would ever accept nuclear power. Fearful of another oil cutoff after Iran's refineries were nationalized in '51, scientists began to experiment with solar batteries. On October 4th, 1957, Soviet scientists shocked the world by orbiting a Sputnik around the Earth. We were worried that if the Russians could launch a baby moon in outer space, they could certainly reach America with intercontinental missiles. President Eisenhower assured us there was no missile gap.
Speed of progress in the satellite project cannot be taken as an index of our progress in ballistic missile work. Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. I consider our country's satellite program to be well designed and properly scheduled to achieve the scientific purposes for which it was initiated.
In 1958, America finally launched a 30-pound satellite into orbit. And as the decade ended, Russia and the U.S. set their sights on the moon.
Last couple of events we'll talk about here. 1959 in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of the United States, the country that we kind of helped gain their independence at the Spanish-American War in 1896, goes through a revolution. Okay, Cuba at that time was kind of the Las Vegas of the 1950s. There were casinos there. The mob had an influence. America owned a lot of the sugarcane plantations, all that stuff. Vegas was a desert. But in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows Fulgencio Batista's government there and begins taking over all of the American and British oil refineries, breaking up all the American-owned sugarcane land, and creating a communist government there in Cuba. And this was a game changer for the United States because communism had always been over there. It had been over in China, over in the Soviet Union, over in North Korea, over in Eastern Europe. And now it was here. It was 90 miles away. Its communist cooties were just about touching us. And for the first time for a lot of Americans, it really cements that fear of communism in us because it was a clear indication that it was spreading, that we were not invulnerable, and that it was getting close. You could see it. And so this really kind of added to those Cold War assumptions. It doesn't help when you see here in the top right picture Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian leader, meeting with Castro, welcoming him to the party, that yes, communism is evil. It's taking over the world. It's now spread to Cuba, and it's all controlled by the Soviet Union, supposedly. So this event is definitely going to further exacerbate the fears of communism. So we up our surveillance of the Soviet Union. We start using this thing right here, the U2 spy plane. At that time period, we clearly don't have a satellite yet. You saw our first attempt there. And what satellites that are up there don't have cameras and technology yet to, like they do today, to film everything from space. So we do the next best thing. We create a plane that can fly at extremely high altitudes and has a high def camera on it that can take pictures of military installations, bases, nuclear sites in the Soviet Union. And so starting in 1955, we began taking photographs and flying these planes over the Soviet Union. They knew about it, but we were hopeful that we were flying at such a high altitude they couldn't shoot them down. and that they were above radar detection, we thought. But we found out in 1958 that they were tracking us. They were getting radar locks. They were actually firing at us at times. But up to this point, we'd had no incidents yet. They were kind of powerless to stop us. They kept complaining in world opinion that we were spying on them. We kept denying it. In 1960, Khrushchev and Eisenhower were due to meet for the first time and have a big meeting and press conference and face-to-face and a little meet and greet. And so Eisenhower ordered that we stop these U-2 flights until after that so that we didn't have any incident. However, they said, well, next week will be the last one. We'll have one more and get a little bit more information, then we'll stop. Well, you can imagine what happens here. And on May 1st, 1960, American Air Corps, and by the name of Francis Gary Powers, goes up in a U-2 plane and doesn't come back. His plane is lost. He doesn't return. We know that he's missing. We actually had given all of our pilots suicide tablets, little cyanide tablets, in case they survived any kind of shoot down. They have ejector seats and everything like that, but at that altitude, even surviving it is somewhat risky. And that way, if they were being interrogated or tortured, they could take this tablet and avoid all that. So they shoot the plane down, and we know it's missing. That's pretty much all we know at that time. And Khrushchev basically lays a trap for the United States. He announces to the world that the American spy plane has crashed. He even produces pictures of airplane wreckage. Now, he purposefully chooses pictures that are not actually of our spy plane. So American analysts look at it and say, hey, shoot, he has nothing. At that altitude, that plane's probably scattered amongst 3,000 miles of space. The pilot clearly died or committed suicide. He's got no evidence. Just deny it, Mr. President. And so President Eisenhower at first denies it. That's when Khrushchev has us by the cojones, because after he catches Eisenhower denying it, he then produces the pilot. And Francis Gary Powers did survive, and he was captured by the Soviets. And so Khrushchev's able to say, really, you can't deny it. If that, otherwise, how did this guy fall into our laps, literally? And so this is very embarrassing. People knew people spied on each other at this time period, but world leaders didn't lie. You were honest. And Eisenhower looks bad in the world of public opinion. He never does apologize to the Soviet Union. We spend the next year and a half working out an exchange in which we give them a captured Soviet spy by the name of Rudolf Abel, and they turn over Francis Gary Powers to us, but it's just kind of a black mark on the whole thing. Khrushchev ends up canceling his trip to meet the American president, and the Cold War kind of refreezes a little bit. So anyway, that's just kind of the end of the foreign policy aspect of everything here with the Cold War. Next class period, we'll start talking about the 1950s and the culture and the cultural changes and why we don't go right back into the Great Depression.